And welcome back. We are talking fiscal discipline or lack of it thereof. And to help us delve more on this issue is Reginald Kadzutu, who is the CIO of Amana Capital. Welcome, Reginald.
Thanks, Reg.
Reginald, I just want to take you back. Last week, Kenya unveiled a $30 billion budget. Reginald, as we know it, and I saw what you wrote in response to the budget, typically, governments, in response to economic downturns, engage in a fiscal expansion. Now, what you have in Kenya is a very puzzling situation where you have a fiscal expansion, but at the same time, you have a very aggressive tax situation. What do you make of this? Do you see any fiscal expansion in this? What are you seeing in this budget?
I think the problem that we have is, for maybe a lack of a better word, called fiscal confusion. Because you cannot, the main purpose of a fiscal policy is to stimulate growth.
That's absolutely
in the economy, and you can only do that using two tools which the government has, either government spending or reduction in taxes. So if your government doesn't want to spend, you can just reduce taxes so that you put more money in people's pockets, which will spur aggregate demand and all. But the unique case that we have had in Kenya for the last 5-6 budgets is that you find the government keeps on increasing expenditure. And to fund that expenditure, they go and increase taxes. So yeah, if you use an illustration of a vehicle, it's stepping on the accelerator and the brekes at the same time.
That's very
so you make a lot of noise, but no progress.
And potentially this car could be from China.
Reginald, the whole premise of Keynesian economics is either you're deficit spending or cutting taxes. And this is ostensibly to take care of, because the cyclical aspect of the economy, sometimes the economy goes into a bust, it goes into a boom, and it's the role of the government to jumpstart the economy. Kenya today, we are at standstill economically. There's evidently, the economy is starved of liquidity. There's literally nothing going on so much. Companies are cutting down on or delaying investments, cutting down on staff. You would expect the government to cut down on taxes. Instead, the government has introduced a top income tax rate of 35% and literally removed any tax exemptions. That's what you call fiscal confusion. I like that word. What do you see any fiscal discipline in this?
No, I think you cannot mention Kenya and fiscal discipline in the same line because there is none. If you look from 2013 to now and you look at the rate of expenditure growth, every budget cycle on average is actually around 16%. If you take an average of the 6 years. The highest, I think, which was 3 years ago, where they increased expenditure by 33%. So the statements of austerity are statements on paper. And the interesting thing, though, is when you look at the actuals, the actual revenue and actual expenditure, you'll always find that budget absorption rate for development is around 50-60. But absorption rate for expenditure is at 140%.
But on the absorption, if I may, on the absorption rate for development, is it the issue? I think the issue is more the funds are not available. Because if you're saying expenditure is over 100%, yet development is 50-60%, is there money for development expenditure in all this fiscal confusion?
No, but the money has been spent on expenditure. Because you find that they will increase absorption rate for expenditure is 140-something%.
That's very high.
So that actually is what saves the total absorption rate, because the total absorption rate is around 85%.
Yes, it is.
Which is now boosted by the 140 in expenditure. So when someone is talking austerity and you are consuming more than what you actually budget for on expenditure, then you start wondering what is actually going on there. Yeah.
What you're saying is that the wage bill, the recurrent portion of the budget, is actually taking up the entire money.
Yes, that and the newfound love called debt. Because if
debt is good, Reginald. Debt is good.
Debt is good if it is productive. Debt becomes not good when it cannot pay for itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because ideally when you're doing leverage, you're leveraging because you know you have streams of income that can pay for that debt. We are at a point where if you look at the amount of borrowing we are taking, so if development expenditure is around 22%, but our borrowing is around 34%. Most of the times you'll hear fiscal deficit is now 4% of GDP. That's hogwash. What you need to look at is revenue versus expenditure. Because you don't pay your expenditure from GDP, you pay from the revenue you've collected.
Yeah.
On an average, in the last 5-6 years, revenue versus expenditure has had a gap of 34%. 2018, we spent 1.6 times what we earned, and the average is around 1.5 times. So you get an average of 34%. So if we are borrowing to cover a gap of 34% and development expenditure is only 22%, that means you're also borrowing either to debt service and pay recurrent expenditure. But that's where we have reached.
Reginald, wouldn't you say this? You know, in a way, if we keep coming back to the Keynesian economics, and it's an important factor because of the kind of economy we've been running, I just find that maybe we are being too punitive on the Treasury Department. I look at it very simply and say, if I am running a business, I have my accounting office. The mandate of the accounting office is to manage when money comes in, when it must come in, vis-a-vis when it goes out. So in a way, you have a situation where Treasury has looked at the global credit market and has seen people are getting near zero returns on the dollar. Number one. Number two, it has gone again and looked at the credit markets and said, if I look at Africa today, the reality is Kenya is number one, if not up to number 3 in terms of worthwhile investable opportunities and investment markets. Yeah. So for them, what they have done, rather than focusing on maybe the deficit, they've said we are able to keep refinancing our credit, and what we are actually doing is forestalling the problem of debt sustainability, where our children, maybe not even our children, us in 5 years, will be left with a huge burden. But I think the element of how they're managing to pay for it, they actually have created a way, and they've been able to tap into the international markets, largely on the premise of very low refinancing risk. So as long as the money is flowing, then it keeps going. And maybe a potential risk factor over and above the element of revenue is how do we actually get to a point where the credit markets say no, and what signals would we be looking out for? Because then that becomes a huge risk factor for anybody who's invested in Kenya.
Using the same analogy on the US dollar, what you need to compare yourself to is you've recently borrowed at 8%
yes.
and 9%. US government paper for 10 years is at 1%, 2%.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for them to lend to you, they're saying you are 8 times more riskier than
yes,
lending to their own government. So you borrow at 9% in US dollars, which is ridiculous. When the government of the US and other major countries can borrow at 1%, 2%.
But they're willing to give it to you because you can pay 8, 9 times.
Yes.
This is Africa.
But then the problem that comes in is you borrow in US dollars,
then you consume
to finance projects that generate Kenya shillings. You don't pay US dollar debt with Kenya shillings. Yeah. So if you're going to borrow in a currency, you have to match the currency of borrowing and the revenue that is generated in that currency. The amount of money borrowed that goes to the 3 main areas that we actually earn foreign currency, that's agriculture, tourism, and diaspora remittances in quotes, is next to none. We've built an SGR, which we don't know what produce we are putting on the SGR, and it has come to Nairobi, and Nairobi is not the bread basket. It's not where we get the tea and the coffee. Why didn't they do Mombasa and just take it directly to wherever there is the tea and the coffee? So the problem that we'll have is we'll have to borrow to repay, because we are not boosting US dollar generating capability to pay for our debt. And unfortunately, when the Kenya shilling projects that we're putting money in are also not generating good shillings for them to pay. And the purchasing power of the shilling is as good as dropping by close to 50% every
But Reginald,
4 or 5
where
years.
is the fiscal multiplier in all these projects? You don't see any fiscal multiplier?
There's no fiscal multiplier. But the reason why there's no fiscal multiplier is when you do a fiscal policy that is focusing on output, again, which I say is the height of confusion.
Yeah.
But the purpose of fiscal policy is to boost aggregate demand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then when this aggregate demand is what will boost output, because the manufacturer will produce more because there's demand for it. All the measures that our teachers put in are all to try and boost output, make it easier for the output to increase. So there's no fiscal multiplier. And the simple way to notice that there's no fiscal multiplier, you spend 2.8 trillion to generate less than 100,000 formal jobs. As in, that doesn't make sense. As in, spending 2.8 trillion to get less than 100,000 jobs, I think we can be able to do that by spending less.
On what? Because let me ask you this. You see, when we say there's no element of fiscal multiplier, then I'll come back and say, who are the people and who are the stakeholders who actually inform the CS in terms of making decisions? And I ask this because last week I attended one of the budget review cocktails or dinners, and there was the membership of KEPSA. And the membership of KEPSA actually said that they thought this was a good budget because it addressed the majority of the requests they had as a manufacturing sector. So when I come back to us, I'm wondering, so is it that the manufacturing sector has demands that may not necessarily be good for the national manufacturing element of Kenya? Do we not have that competitive advantage? Or is the CS not being informed by the right people?
It's simple, Reginald. Our production competitive?
I won't go on who advises the CS, but I know the CS advises the president.
Yeah.
So I'll have beef with the CS. I don't know who advises him. Why we don't have a multiplier? Again, looking at manufacturing sector. Our manufacturing sector is 98% agro processing. So you pump money into a value addition without pumping money into what supplies the value addition. So these guys have cheap electricity, but what maize are they grinding to make the unga? There is no maize. We are importing the maize. So if you're going to get a multiplier effect, 70% of all the employed people work in the agricultural sector. If you increase the income of the factors of production, and income, not this 6.3% GDP, if you increase the income of the factors...
You mean the wages?
The wages.
Yeah, the income.
Go to the individuals.
Income in terms of the T-placa, the owner of the land, getting higher return on their money, letting the shilling go to where it's supposed to go so that you don't sell in dollars and end up with useless shillings after you sell your things in dollars. So if the income of the T-placa increases, he will start demanding more things because he has more money. You say, no, I think I want a better house, or I want a motorbike, or I want a radio, I want a phone. When that demand is now there, private sector will come and say, okay, there's a demand for housing at 4 million. Let me go into housing for 4 million. The baker says, oh, there's more demand for bread. Let me hire more people because I need to produce more bread. So he has also reduced unemployment. Those people he has hired also now have a salary and also can now demand a phone, demand a radio, demand a motorcycle. Then you start having a multiplier effect. But if you pump funds into less than 15% of the employed people, then you tax them like there's no tomorrow. You're not going to get a multiplier
Fair
effect.
enough. Let's take a break. It's market close, and we're going to have a bell ringing ceremony for the market close. And then we'll come back to that same thought. Definitely have a lot of questions around that.